Welcome to the Jenna Ellis Show, sponsored by Legacy Precious Metals. There has never been a better time to invest in precious metals. Visit legacypminvestments.com. That's legacypminvestments.com. Good evening and welcome to Jenna Ellis Tonight. So violent riots and protests are continuing across campuses in the nation, including Columbia University, which seems to be at the center of all of this pro-Hamas, pro-terror sorts of protests from these students. And New York Representative Anthony D'Esposito posted some of the footage that shows the graphic violence and the destruction of property that's occurring at Columbia University. Watch this. Meanwhile, academic administrators at several universities are calling basically for clemency. This headline coming earlier this week from the National Review. Princeton faculty demand university reinstate arrested anti-Israel grad students. A group of more than 100 Princeton faculty and postdocs have signed a letter demanding that the university reinstate and expunge the records of two graduate students who were arrested for trespassing while participating in an anti-Israel protest last week. Quote, this repressive action undertaken at the behest of the university administration constitutes a grave threat to freedom of speech, dissent, and assembly on the Princeton campus, reads the open letter, which was released on Saturday. So joining me now to discuss is Jeff Myers, the president of Summit Ministries out of Manitou Springs, Colorado, where I am a very proud graduate all the way back when I was 16 and headed into college. So Jeff, so great to have you on the program. And, you know, this type of violence and destruction of property, this in no way is protected by the First Amendment. And it really bothers me to see some of these academic administrators that are trying to basically allow these students to not suffer adult consequences for their conduct.
There's something going on behind the scenes here, Jenna, as you well know, and that is an oppressor versus oppressed mindset that has been indoctrinated into the minds and hearts of these students by those very professors. It has turned anti-Semitic. It has turned pro-terrorist. And these are no longer just people who are standing on a public sidewalk giving their viewpoint. These are people who have trespassed onto private property with the intent to do damage, with the intent to be violent. And it is terrifying Jewish students. And I'm not the attorney in this conversation, but I would definitely be having lawsuits against these universities if I were them, because they're obligated to protect their students and they're not doing it.
Yeah, I mean, they clearly have a viewpoint discrimination, because if these were pro-Israel protests or maybe pro-Christian protests, pro-life protests that in any way, shape, or form even remotely turned this type of violent, then you know that the universities would crack down. So this does come down to a worldview issue, which is essentially cultural Marxism, right? Because when you mention, Jeff, the oppressor versus the oppressed, in their sort of social justice warrior mindset, this type of conduct is permissible and in fact is lauded and applauded and encouraged under a Marxist theory that we have to rise up against our oppressors. And so this is just a display of exactly what these types of woke universities are promulgating.
Well, the narrative in public is this is a debate between Israelis who are said by these very professors to be white colonialist settlers and a people group called the Palestinians, which isn't really a group in any normal sense of the term. But that's not what it's about. This is about something else. This is about a belief by these professors that the basic theory of Karl Marx, that life can be very simply divided into the oppressors versus the oppressed, it is the way we should view the world. And so Israel is always, in every situation, viewed at least four times as negatively as any other nation that would be doing something similar. And this is the core of anti Semitism. That double standard that is held is the core definition of what it means to be anti Semitic. You don't have to support everything that Israel does to recognize that these behaviors and actions are threatening, and they look very, very much like Germany just prior to World War II. In fact, the alliance, I'm sorry, the ADL, Alliance Against Defamation. I'm losing the name of it all of a sudden, but
The
they have said that
Anti-Defamation League, yeah.
Anti-Defamation League, the anti-Semitic acts are at their highest level since 1979. This is a once in a generation conflict, and we've seen the rising generation go off the rails.
Yeah, and Jeff, and I've asked prior guests on this show and this question, and I'm very interested in your take because of your work in academia and especially with college students. Why it seems like the younger generation in America, even among Christians, seems to have this anti-Israel bent, almost at least in conservative circles, under this America First aura or the auspices of saying, if we are pro-Israel, then that means we're Israel first instead of America first. And they're not, I think, really recognizing, certainly not like some of these cultural Marxist students. Conservative students aren't recognizing how they're ceding the worldview ground in that argument. But what do you attribute that to?
There are two things that I think need to be addressed. The first one is what you just mentioned. Even conservative students are backing away from support of Israel. They do not understand that in global governance, we are this close to a world government, with the United Nations gaining more and more power and more sovereignty. Israel and its relationship with the United States is one of the only sticking points preventing that. So, just as a matter of preserving America's national sovereignty, I think we need to support Israel. But why are people against Israel? I think there are three reasons, really. The first one is probably a legitimate one. Americans tend to support the underdog. And if they can figure out who they think the underdog is, then that's who they're going to support. But that has gone completely off the rails for two reasons. Number one, the anti American sentiment that has been promulgated in high school and college classrooms for young people.
Mm.
Only 16% of the rising generation say they are proud to be Americans. And the second one is the
And
oppressor
then Jeff,
versus
we're going to have
oppressed
to take a
mindset.
hard break here, and I'm so sorry. We'll continue this conversation into the next segment when we come right back here on Jenna Ellis Tonight. Continuing my conversation with Jeff Myers, who's the president of Summit Ministries out of Manitou Springs, Colorado. And Jeff, before I had to very rudely cut you off, you were explaining what you attribute this very anti-Israel or definitely not pro-Israel sentiment among even conservatives in the younger generation.
Yes, well, conservatives have a view that a lot of conservatives, we should have America first, and that has become America only among those in the rising generation. And I completely understand why. After all of these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we're $8 trillion poorer, millions of people have been displaced and killed, and what do we have to show for it? So a lot of young adults are saying, hey, look, if we get involved in yet another war, and they're specifically referring to the one in Israel, then we're just going to continue ceding our sovereignty. I think that's a misunderstanding of what's actually taking place. America's relationship with Israel does a number of things for us, including helping us maintain our national sovereignty up against a United Nations that has gone completely nuts. And so the world community and its approach to Israel is bizarre. This is the worst I think that it's ever been since the formation of Israel in 1948.
And as we're seeing the worldview in college campuses now, come to life in some of these very violent and destructive ways. This is exactly the heart of Summit Ministries: is to teach worldviews and to critically think about them, rather than just go to these universities or indoctrination camps and kind of just take what the professors tell you as true and as truthful, and then you see how this is played out when you really have to confront some of these real world issues. And so, from the perspective of cultural Marxism that is being taught to our younger generation through institutions, how do we as conservatives, particularly Christians, combat that with the truth of a biblical worldview?
The first thing, Jenna, is you've got to understand what this cultural Marxist viewpoint says, because we conservatives throw this term around an awful lot, and other people are like, yeah, sure, that's not really what it is. We don't really think that much of Karl Marx. But their mindset is only the material world exists. There's only so much to go around. So any one person who has anything more than anybody else, they've stolen it. That's the only possible explanation. That worldview is the dominant one taught in a lot of university classes. And it's not a religious worldview that we're talking about on the surface of it, but below the surface, there's absolutely something going on here that's religious. I thought it would be a conflict between Christianity and Islam, but that's not what's going on at all. Hamas and its fellow travelers are operating from a Marxist worldview that says they are always the oppressed, and therefore anything they do, even aggressive actions, counts as legitimate self-defense. That's why the Gaza Health Ministry, for example, does not distinguish between combatant and non-combatant deaths, because they do not believe they have any combatants. If a Hamas fighter ran toward the IDF blazing with an AK-47 and got killed, they would not consider that person to be a fighter. Every person who is dead in that situation, they consider to be a martyr who died in legitimate self-defense. So we're not dealing with a worldview where we can understand it in the normal terms. This is not your parents' Israel-Palestine conflict.
That is so fascinating, Jeff, because like you, I think I would have expected this to be more of an Islam Israel conflict, and I think that a lot of the maybe older generation evangelicals are framing it that way. So, how did cultural Marxism infiltrate or infect Hamas to have? I mean, certainly we understand from the college student or the academic perspective, but is this just here in America, or is that abroad as well?
Well, that's a great point, because in Hamas, they're very, very clear about exactly what they believe. They do not hide any of this. They put it on social media posts. We Americans don't see it because it's all written in Arabic, and we assume that if anybody has anything important to say, they'll say it in English, which is not true. But they've also lined it out in 2006 and 2017 in a charter, which specifically calls for the annihilation of the state of Israel. The older charter calls for the killing of Jews, and the modern charter says that everything that Hamas does is legitimate self-defense because it is in a state of being oppressed. Now, in the United States, Hamas believes that this is true because they believe they're the central cause of Ummah. They believe they're trying to call the global Islamic community to their side. But in the United States, people don't know or care about that. It's just leftist progressives who've decided that, look, the world really is that simple. Israel has more military. Israel has greater wealth. Therefore, they're the oppressor. The Palestinians, as I mentioned earlier, not actually a group. It's several different tribes trying to function together and are actually at civil war with one another. These people are the oppressed. Therefore, anything we do on their behalf is righteous and valid and justified.
And see, Jeff, when you understand it in this framework, then you can begin to understand why these pro-Hamas and pro-terror groups are suggesting that even Israel defending itself is perpetuating harm, and how Hamas is the victim of anything that Israel does, even if it is obviously in self-defense, because anything that they do as the oppressor is to just perpetrate the continued oppression of Hamas. So there's not this sort of just war theory. There's not the rules of engagement. We're not starting on a rational playing field. We are starting on a cultural Marxist playing field. And so the rules of engagement are completely different.
Yes, the cultural Marxist view is a simplistic understanding of the world. You have to want to not understand the world to actually believe it. Are there situations where Israel has acted overly aggressively? It's possible, but as I look at this from a just war context, And even in the issue of proportionality, Israel has bound itself to rules of engagement that are stricter than any other nation of the world, including the United States. They have allowed tons of humanitarian aid to come in, enough to feed 50% of the population of Gaza, even though 75% of Gaza's agricultural production is still intact. A lot of people don't know that. So if people in Gaza are starving, it is not because of Israel, it is because of Hamas. They're continuing, their leaders, who are millionaires and billionaires, are continuing to skim international aid for their own purposes. In fact, recently the United States said we should build a pier so we can bring aid, and Hamas said, "I don't. If IDF defends that pier, then we're going to attack them. If any other nation defends that pier, we're going to attack them too." They do not care about the fate of everyday Gazans. They want Israel annihilated. That is the main aim, and they've been super clear about that. It's just Americans aren't willing to hear if it doesn't fit their pre-existing narrative.
Right. We just have about 30 seconds left, but do you think that these professors that are promulgating this understand it this clearly, or are they just kind of victims of their cultural Marxist notions in academia and ivory towers?
The professors understand it. But listen, for Gen Z, 75%, they don't have a sense of purpose that gives meaning to their lives. They just think they're doing something that is meaningful. They don't understand at all. They are open to the facts if we can give them.
And that's why we need to give it to them. So Jeff Myers, really appreciate it. And I would encourage every student, go to Summit Ministries, learn worldviews. We'll be right back with more. So, as the protests and violence have continued this week across campus, earlier in the week, the House Republicans held a press conference in which several members spoke and talked specifically about defunding federally some of these universities with dollars that were allowing these protests. This is what the Education and Workforce Committee Chairwoman Virginia Fox had to say.
No stone must go unturned while buildings are being defaced, campus greens are being captured, or graduations are being ruined. College is not a park for play-acting juveniles or a battleground for radical activists. Everyone affiliated with these universities will receive a healthy dose of reality. Actions have consequences.
Ken Tashjy, who is a campus reform fellow and author of that opinion piece, joins me now. So, Ken, how, in practical terms, can Congress quickly and expediently remove federal funding from these universities that clearly have no interest in actually taking measures to quell the riots and the violence?
Well, Jenna, thank you very much for having me. Title VI allows the federal government to consider withholding federal funding from those institutions that are allowing discrimination based on race or color or national origin, or in this case, membership in a religious organization, that being Jewish students, federal funding under Title VI. The reality, though, is that in many cases, the federal government fails to take that step. Frankly, they even failed to wield the threat of that step. But hopefully, under the current circumstances, as Representative Wolf indicated, the time is right to reconsider the use of Title VI and the power Congress now has to really consider the withholding of funds from those institutions that have just allowed what they're alleging is peaceful protest, but what in reality is just a mob action on our college campuses.
Yeah, and obviously the Republicans have a very slim majority, and heading into November, hopefully that will be expanded. But do you think that there is appetite for Republicans to actually band together for this and take some serious action? Because it's doubtful that any Democrats are going to sign on.
I would hope there's an appetite to address this issue through the federal funding mechanism. I would, though, also hope, and I think it's probably more realistic, to hope that pressure from Congress on college and university presidents to address the conduct on their campuses immediately is likely to be more forthcoming and sooner than Congress acting.
And how would this practically affect, some students who, Jewish students, for example, who are bearing the brunt of being targeted by, some of these protests, or students who just have no interest at all in even participating on either side? I mean, what type of ramifications could this have, and would that be a defense potentially for the universities to say, hey, listen, don't punish everyone for the actions of a few?
Yeah, look, the reality is the First Amendment protects peaceful protests on college campuses. It applies specifically to public institutions. Second point is it has absolutely no application to private institutions. The First Amendment does not apply there. Campuses, though, that are private still allow for peaceful protests, but students generally have to follow specific rules. The same with public colleges. And what you're seeing right now are not students that are engaging in reasonable discussion, debates over issues. They're not interested in following campus rules or regulations about peaceful protests. And they're surely not interested in tolerating other people's views and positions here. This is really a mob message that's being pushed, and they're looking to use any means necessary to do so. And the brunt of this is being received by Jewish students, and those individuals have some level of recourse at their institution under Title VI. They also have recourse under state law if they're subject to discrimination or intimidation or threats, all of which is illegal, and none of that finds cover under the First Amendment. And to claim otherwise is just really a lack of knowledge or information about the scope and protection that the First Amendment provides.
And I think that's such an important piece of this, because if you look even at some of the conversation on social media, and it seems like, everyone is suddenly an expert in the next new thing, whatever is going on in the news. Everyone has opinions and they're entitled to their opinions, but they're not entitled to their facts. They're not entitled to their view of wrong law. But it seems like people who are for these pro-Hamas protesters are somehow saying that the First Amendment should protect this, when in reality on university campuses, it should be that there's free and fair debate and there's discussion, there's a free exchange of ideas. That's not, as you rightly pointed out, going on here. And so how should the average person look at this, particularly when the administration isn't enforcing the rules, and when it seems like the local law enforcement is either hesitant or maybe doesn't have a whole lot of jurisdiction to come on when they're not invited by the administration to do so?
Yeah, look, I think higher education is at a real crossroads right now. It needs to decide, is it going to remain a center for teaching and learning, which is at its core mission, or are they going to abrogate that responsibility to the mob? And unfortunately, you have a lot of college administrators and many college presidents that are unwilling to make the very tough decisions about dealing with this kind of conduct on their campuses. Remember, these are folks that have perpetuated the diversity, equity, and inclusion dogma of the day that says that if you oppose or prohibit the kind of speech that you're seeing on campus, this kind of protesting, the assault on individual students, the assault on property, that you're really an oppressor under the parlance of the day. And they're having a real difficulty reconciling their role and responsibility as a college administrator and a college president with this type of conduct on their campus.
Yeah, it's really just shameful to see what these academic institutions are allowing to be perpetuated, under the guise of, we're not going to even contemplate what the viewpoint discrimination is. And it seemed like Columbia's statement that was put out, late Tuesday night was really apologetic for even calling law enforcement or dealing with this. So I can really appreciate your perspective on this. We'll be right back with more here on Jenna Ellis Tonight.
Stacey Washington Now, your go-to for a fresh, informed take on the political world. Stacey tackles today's crucial issues with a dynamic blend of news, opinion, and analysis. Don't miss Stacey Washington Now, weekdays at 5 p.m. Eastern on SNC.
Have you heard? Jenna Ellis Tonight is on 5 nights a week. Count on Jenna Ellis for insightful commentary on the day's biggest stories.
We can still consistently be conservatives.
Jenna Ellis Tonight, weeknights at 9 p.m. Eastern on Salem News Channel.
So we're continuing to talk about these increasingly violent protests, riots that are taking place on college campuses throughout the nation. And what does this say about the worldview of our young people who are going to institutions that are government funded, and they're coming out as cultural Marxists rather than understanding what it means to actually love America? So joining me now is Jeff Hunt, who is the host of the Jeff and Bill Show on Salem's Denver radio network, KNUS, and that I believe is from 6 to 10 a.m. Mountain Time. And Jeff, you used to work with Colorado Christian University. Very, very different response, I can imagine, from that administration if protests like this were happening on that college campus. But with your experience in academia, I mean, what does this tell you about the administration and these professors that are not only not engaging this appropriately, not quelling this appropriately, and actually administering, but in some instances are even participating?
Yeah, I've got one phrase for you, Jenna. More Animal House, less Hamas House. You're college students. Have some fun, for Pete's sake. Look, these college students better get used to living in a tent, especially at Columbia University, where they spend $345,000 to get a 4-year degree. And if you got a liberal arts degree, that's where you're going to be living for the rest of your life, in a tent. Look, these college students don't have any idea what's going on in the world. They think that a Gaza Strip is some type of Band-Aid that their mom would give them, okay? They're so out of touch, and they're just Marxists. They've grown up being Marxists. I don't think that there's really an undercurrent of anti-Semitism in America. I don't really see it that much, but I do think for the last 20, 30 years, students have been told that there is a conflict of oppressor versus oppressed happening. And if you just read the first page of the Communist Manifesto, you'll see it right there. All of history is oppressor versus oppressed, and we need to institute institutional change in order to achieve parity. Look, they have been taught to believe there is systemic racism in this country. There's systemic bias. There's all these problems that exist because there's oppressors versus oppressed. And when you buy into that, when you believe that is the case, then you greenlight the oppressed to do whatever they want against the oppressor. So think about what Hamas did against Israel, right? They painted Israel as the oppressor. So on October 7th, did they go attack military installations in Israel? No, they attacked innocent women and children. They raped, tortured. They put babies in ovens. They attacked innocent people. But if you believe you've been oppressed, then you believe that you can do that. And so for the last 30, 40 years in this country, we have taught young people that there are systemic biases, systemic oppressor versus oppressed taking place in this country. And now they believe it, and they're playing it out on college campuses. So I don't think it's really rooted in anti-Semitism. I sure as heck hope not. I pray that they have at least been educating the Holocaust in some capacity. But I do really think that they believe that there's oppressors in this world, and they need to take them on. That's what I think.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Jeff, because if we compare this, like I have been this week on this show, to the summer of the BLM riots. I mean, that was all cultural Marxism as well, but the oppressor in that case was the systemic racism of all white people who need to categorically apologize for the sins of our ancestors and apologize for our whiteness against Black people. And we have seen that the color divide, which had nothing to do with anti-Semitism or anything else, was still at the root the same type of cultural Marxism. And that ideology that has infiltrated our universities, college campuses, and has now proliferated into our culture and our society. So I think that there are a lot of parallels here. It's just the identity of the oppressors and the oppressed maybe looks a little bit different now, but it's the same fundamental ideology.
That's exactly right. So what's the antidote to this? The antidote is Christian, Judeo-Christian, Western individual responsibility, right? That you are responsible for your own actions. You can have a difference of opinion with regards to foreign policy between Israel and Hamas. You can't take over the student union. You just can't. Under the Marxist worldview, sure, we're oppressed. We're going to take over the student union. We're going to kick out the administrators. We're going to take over campus buildings. We're going to harass Jews when they're on college campuses. If you operate under the Marxist worldview, all of that is greenlit. But if you're under the Judeo-Christian, Western, individual responsibility thought line, then you can't do that. You're not allowed to do that. You are responsible for your own actions. You have to argue in the public square to try to convince people to change their thought. You can't just violate people because you disagree with them. So the antidote, the fix to all this is to go back to public education in our country, root out Marxist thinking, and replace it with Judeo-Christian Western thought.
Yeah, and you're so right, Jeff, because this is exactly what the left would like to undercut and rewrite is the entire destruction of Western civilization that is predicated on a Judeo-Christian worldview. They want to bring in cultural Marxism to transform Western society. And so, of course, the antidote is going back to our roots, back to our founding heritage, back to an understanding that our rights are pre-political. They come from God, our creator. That is the Judeo-Christian God of the Bible, not the oppressor versus the oppressed or any other manufactured sort of understanding of the human condition. And all of these ideologies are so important that we understand what's actually going on in society, because I'm seeing a lot of these social media commentary just focused on the individual conflict in the Middle East, the individual college campuses, the individual, the Biden administration allowing all of these Gaza and Palestinian refugees. I mean, all of these things that are actually coming from the same worldview. People tend to just sort of piecemeal respond from a political policy perspective. I think that's also the wrong idea. We need to have a comprehensive worldview.
That's exactly right. And if you're a parent of a college student, do not send your kids to these schools. Why are you going to spend, in the case of Columbia University, $345,000 for them to teach you this nonsense? There are great conservative schools out there like Liberty University, like Hillsdale College, that will actually train your students to embrace the values you spent 18 years putting into them. So the way we stop this, especially at the higher level, stop sending your kids to these schools.
Yes, and parents need to be responsible for their own kids. We do not co-parent with the government. We'll be right back with more with Jeff Hunt. We're back with Jeff Hunt, who is a Salem media radio host out of Denver on KNUS. And Jeff, we're still talking about Kristi Noem and this just absolutely stupid, asinine vignette that she chose to put into her book. And it's so funny because now Mitt Romney is responding to this thinking, hey, this isn't nearly as bad as my dog story from a couple years ago. So I'm going to just celebrate this, that finally somebody has a worse dog story than me. This headline coming from The Guardian. Mitt Romney says his dog scandal doesn't compare to Kristi Noem's. I didn't shoot my dog. Republican senator says Noem's story of killing her 14-month-old hunting dog makes her unlikely to be Trump's running mate. I'd agree with that. Mitt Romney may have infamously tied a dog in a kennel to the roof of his car for a cross-country trip, but at least he didn't shoot it, the Utah Republican senator said, as outrage over the South Dakota governor Kristi Noem telling her story of killing a 14-month-old hunting dog continued to ripple through U.S. politics. Quote, I didn't eat my dog. I didn't shoot my dog. I loved my dog, and my dog loved me, Romney said on Capitol Hill on Tuesday, as reported by HuffPost. This sounds like Mitt Romney, Jeff, could start writing a Dr. Seuss book. But I just thought this was funny that he's finally saying, hey, somebody has a worse dog story than me.
Yeah, and if you remember, Mitt Romney strapped his dog to the top of the car and then drove on a family vacation with it. So he's no saint. But Jenna, isn't it amazing that Kristi Noem, in a single shot, killed 2 animals, shot herself in the foot, and ended her quest to become the vice president of the United States? I mean, she should be on Top Shot. That's amazing. But look, we all knew it was going to be a problem with Kristi Noem when, as a child, she clapped at the end of Old Yeller. No, this was heartbreaking. As someone who raises dogs, guardian livestock dogs, and goats, There was no reason for her to do this. This was the wrong choice. This was, at the end of the day, just cruel. But on a lighter note, Jenna, I heard that the Biden administration's interested in giving Kristi Noem a job. That's right. The White House staff would now like Kristi Noem to dog set Major, Joe Biden's dog that keeps biting the Secret Service. Maybe that's a way they could figure out that problem. But look, the only person that benefits from all this is Michael Vick. He's learned that he now has a new opportunity in politics. But look, this was just purely a cruel decision from Kristi Noem. This was a 14-month-old dog. This was a dog. Anybody who's raised dogs, and we breed Colorado Mountain Dogs. These are guardian livestock dogs. They live out with the goats and the sheep and the chickens. So we actually train dogs around chickens, right? So this was a failure to train, first and foremost, right? The dog was not acting properly. But any breeder would always take the dog back, So if it's not working out, they're happy to take the dog back and rehome them, retrain them, and figure it out. So it was a training problem. I think Kristi Noem lost her cool, and probably that was the reason that she shot the dog. But as somebody who raises goats too, a lot of people don't realize this. That was in many ways almost the worst offense, because I understand that sometimes dogs bite people and they need to be put down. The goat, though, was doing nothing different than just being a boy goat. Everything she describes there is exactly what boy goats do on a daily basis. So we have an entire pasture of boy goats. We keep them separate from the girl goats, so I don't have 2,000 goats to raise. But the boy goats, when you walk in there, it's like WrestleMania. It's WWE. They want to headbutt you. They want to wrestle. They're fun. They're full of energy. And then, not to get too graphic, but the boy goats, to attract the girl goats, they kind of spray their own scent on their chin. And that's how the girl goats get excited about being around the boy goats. So everything she describes about the boy goat was just him being a boy goat. So this poor boy goat's drug out to this quarry, and then she misses on the first shot, and then has to go back to the truck, get the shotgun shell, and shoot it again. It's wounded. Oh, my goodness. I've never seen someone end their vice presidential aspirations so quickly by themselves. She did this to herself. Unbelievable.
And you have to wonder, Jeff, like, where was the vetting process in this? Because even if Kristi Noem, as she's tried to defend this, suggests that, this shows that I can make tough decisions. I mean, most people, their tough decision would never even come into their realm of contemplation. Yeah, the tough decision I'm going to have to make today is shooting my 14-month-old puppy in the face. Like, that just that's not part of our daily reality, even for farm people, as you well know. But where were her political advisors on this that were like, oh yeah, Kristi, good story. Yeah, let's print this. This will impress the GOP base.
Look, you can come back from just about anything in politics except for shooting your dog. And maybe there is a silver lining to all this, that Americans still love their dogs, right? And we still appreciate them. No, she's toast. She's done. I don't know how she can ever come back from this, because look, who does Donald Trump need to appeal to most in this next election?
Suburban women.
Suburban women who love their dogs. I don't know anybody who's going to look at this and go, you know who I'm going to vote for now? Kristi Noem. Look, the only thing she could do at this point is, right. The only thing she could do at this point is pull an Alec Baldwin and say the gun went off by itself.
Yeah, well, she's trying to reinvent her book and rewrite it. But, maybe if the White House doesn't have a gravel pit behind, the Oval Office, that she can get a job with Major and all of that. The other potential that she has, of course, is Dr. Fauci and the NIH labs that are doing those experiments on puppies. So it seems like Kristi Noem may be in good company with Fauci. But Jeff, this was also just inexplicable that some conservatives just knee-jerk response are trying to defend this, where I'm thinking this is not at all even about infighting. I mean, we can and we should, when there is something so egregiously, obviously stupid in politics, even if you just want to take the political perspective and call it out and say, nah, Kristi Noem, this probably wasn't the wisest thing. So, I mean, just in the last minute we have here with you, Jeff, I mean, can't we at least be that honest as Republicans and conservatives?
Take this as somebody who worked for Rick Santorum, Mitt Romney, supported Donald Trump, is a rancher with guardian livestock dogs and goats. This is not how you treat your animals. You don't need to do it. And it's perfectly fine to condemn another Republican when they make a decision like this. Plus, there's so many other great choices for VP. Look at Tulsi Gabbard. Look at Ben Carson. Look at all these, J.D. Vance, all these great opportunities. It's time to move on from Kristi Noem. She can finish out her term in South Dakota.
Yeah, well, her political career, I think, has been proverbially taken to the gravel pit and shot in the face. So, Jeff Hunt, really appreciate your commentary. That is all the time we have here on Jenna Ellis Tonight on this great Friday. Make it a great weekend, and we will see you on Monday with more here on the Salem News Channel.